Are you a crappy partner, crappy wife, crappy husband, crappy mate? This podcast is for you. Give yourself the gift of self-awareness. Learn new skills. Take the time to assess your partnership, marriage, relationship, etc. So how are we going to do this? Start by taking the Crappy Mate quiz. The quiz can be found on our website, www.crappymate.com, on Pinterest, Crappy Mate, Instagram and Facebook, Crappy Mate Podcast. We will dedicate episodes to discussing the quiz topics. In further episodes, we will be exploring common problems, the speed bumps that occur in relationships. Also, we will introduce time-tested skills and helpful hints to enhance your relationship, and we invite you, our listeners, to contribute your thoughts, questions, or concerns regarding relationships. Welcome to the Crappy Mate Podcast. I'm Dr. Richard Vance Barnes, MD. I'm a board-certified general psychiatrist with 25 plus years in psychiatry. I have treated patients in a variety of settings, both inpatient units, outpatient units, partial hospitalization units, as well as detoxification programs and rehabilitation programs. And I've had a private practice for many, many years.
And I'm Barbara Quaid, a marriage and family therapist. I also have over 25 years experience working with families, individuals, and couples. And my life as a therapist has been both humbling and joyful. Before we get started, I'd just like to talk about our disclaimer. The Crappy Mate podcast is designed to be a useful tool to help individuals and couples have happier and healthier relationships. This podcast is not a substitute for individual or couples therapy, and as always, relationships need to be safe. Seek professional help as needed.
The Crappy Mate podcast was developed out of hearing years and years of stories and accounts from patients in therapy about their mates and themselves actually being crappy mates and poorly behaving within the relationship. And so this concept was then developed into a podcast of how can we help people to actually improve upon their relationships.
And so in order to do this, we developed a quiz. And the quiz, we really thought about some concepts that we thought were important in a relationship. And so the Crappy Mate quiz ended up being a 10-question self-scoring assessment that can be found on our Facebook page. And our Facebook page is aptly named the Crappy Mate Podcast. And along with the quiz, you will find a glossary with the terms we used both in the podcast and on the quiz. And this is so we can all be on the same page. Now, to score the quiz, you will read each question carefully and then ask yourself, do I do this almost always, sometimes, or almost never? And when we thought about this, the scoring is like this. Almost always is worth 3 points. Sometimes 2 points, and almost never 1 point. So once you have your total points, you add them up. And a score of 10 to 17 clearly indicates that one needs improvement. A score of 17 to 24, one has a degree of awareness, but improvement can still be beneficial. And a score of 24 to 30, one is aware, insightful, and acting in a positive manner as it pertains to the relationship.
Welcome to the Crappy Mate Podcast. In today's episode, we wanted to continue to talk about the holidays and anxiety and expectations, anticipation that the holidays bring, and be more specific this episode, Barbara. I wanted to talk more about the specific stressors that bring about some of the anxiety during the holidays.
Well, I think number one is oftentimes it's anniversaries of the death of our loved ones, or it's a first. And what I mean by a first is, a person has died that year. And so you've gone through a first birthday, a first Thanksgiving, and all these first holidays.
Yes, holidays are a trigger point, I think, for loss for people, and especially that first anniversary of the death of someone during that holiday season is really a difficult time for most people and presents as a real source of anxiety and really at times depression too.
Well, and we're trying to figure out how to include that person, or there might be some guilt about enjoying the season, but they're not there to enjoy it. So it's complicated. It's complicated to see how you decide to think about that person without putting a wet blanket over any holiday gatherings.
It's quite challenging, and I think that most people will shy away from the holidays because of that. And they don't know how to really celebrate and to have joy when they have sorrow as well, based on their loss. So, I can recall one of my patients in terms of they had lost a child and by way of death. And that first Christmas, for instance, that first holiday Christmas, that first Christmas was really difficult for that family and for my patient because they didn't really know how to really celebrate. They didn't know how to enjoy the season, even though they had such sorrow inside.
One of the things that I tell people in session is you can be invited to some of these celebrations and you can accept, but you always tell them that you might change your mind at the last minute. So if you are grieving, you can decide to stay home. You can decide not to go to some of these celebrations.
What I tell my patients is I try to get them to get out of their space and to travel or to go to a place that's different and unique from their own home, because I think the distraction is healthy for them during the season, and especially during that first holiday where they're still adjusting to the loss of their loved one. And that's something that I get my patients to actually practice that have these issues around people having died and they're trying to celebrate during the season.
I have one patient who decided to they did things the same way year after year after year. And then after the loss of family member, they just changed things around a little bit. So they changed some of the rituals, or they changed the color scheme, or they did something to make some changes so that they could still honor the person that they lost, but they're not doing it with the same traditions as when that person was alive.
How does that work out for your patient?
Well, it helps them not to have those triggers, because this is the whole thing. If you had, a certain way that you do something, you're going to feel the loss of that person more. So you can change some of those traditions, maybe not radically, but just in a little way, so that you can feel that it's a little bit different now.
You talk about change. Another area that I think is really difficult during the holidays is issues around divorce. And who do you go to see when you are trying to visit family members and there's a divorce? Perhaps it's mom or dad that are now divorced. And how do you divide your time? How do you spend time with mom, for instance? How do you spend time with dad? Or if you have children, where do your children go after the divorce? How do you celebrate the holiday with your children after divorce? And does your spouse get the children this year, or you get the children this year? That presents as just a major form of stress for people during the holidays as well. So divorce is quite a challenge during the holiday season.
Well, that's one of the losses. And so this is a loss of the same family traditions, or it's the loss of the relationship itself. Or it's the loss where you don't have the kids with you and you're lonely.
Yes, I agree. No, these are a form of loss, and divorce is a form of loss. And it's also, to me, it signifies a change in the family, right? In terms of how we may have been doing things traditionally as a family, and now we're not.
So a lot of changes during the holidays.
A lot of changes. So I wanted to talk about also the pressure of finances during the holiday season, because the financial problems that people have quite often will be covered up. We'll use excessive spending by way of a credit card, for instance, because we may not have the funds liquid enough. But I think the whole issue of spending during the holiday season presents as just a great form of stress for people. And obviously, it puts stress on a relationship.
Obviously. And it's the pressure to do big things, big grand gestures, but it's also we may not have the means. And not having the means makes it much more difficult for families.
I think when you look at that, I think we have a lot of signals in our society today that tells us that we have to spend and we have to be lavish about our gifts. And I think having the financial issues and not having the financial means presents as such a stressor for people during the holiday season. It really does.
Well, and that brings us to all the pressures of society. And, Dr. B, you were just telling me that, most big box stores or companies, they do most of their business during the holiday season, say between November and January.
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, the U.S. economy in particular really depends on Christmas spending and the holiday spending to stay afloat in most cases. I mean, it's big.
So we're getting barraged with all of this spend, have fun, eat, party excessively, all of these pressures from society.
Yes, I would agree with that. And, when we talk about the pressures, people will handle pressures differently, as we know. And in therapy, you'll hear quite often that, for instance, I will work out more. That's my way of coping with stress. But, there are people that will abuse substances during this time, or they'll increase their use of substances during this time to deal with the stress of the holidays.
I think you're right about that. So there's more drinking. We're seeing more drinking in the movies that we see, in all the commercials that we watch. So it's all this eat, drink, and be merry. And if you're not happy, if you're not merry, you might be using these substances to cover up grief or anxiety or depression.
I would agree with that. And of course, if you're abusing substances and you're drinking too much, etc., you're going to impact your relationship, and you're going to also have an impact on how the holidays will proceed.
I agree with that. One of the things we haven't talked about are health issues. And I'm talking about physical health and mental health. And certainly having health issues is always difficult during the holiday seasons. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree with that. And I'm reminded of patients that I have that have chronic pain syndromes. And, the chronic pain folks they'll have difficulties enjoying themselves. They'll have difficulties seeing the joy in life because they're in chronic pain. They're in constant agony. And so this brings about a lot of pressure during the holidays to try and have the front of being happy when maybe internally they're really suffering. And I think it impacts also relationships greatly too, because you'll find people that are not feeling well and they'll be perhaps grouchy, or they'll be short with other people, or they'll just be outright irritable. And I think the pressures of the holidays to be happy, to be joyful, to have just a wonderful time becomes a little much for people that are having the health concerns.
And I think that speaks to people putting on a good face, a fake face, honestly, to show that you're having fun, but you might not be. Mm-hmm. And then comparing yourself to other people, to your colleagues, to your neighbors, to other family members. So a lot is going on during the holidays. It brings up a lot of issues.
It really does. And the comparison piece, I think, has gotten worse through the years because of social media and social networking. And, if you open up most Facebook pages, you see people happy, they're joyful, they're showing off all the wonderful things that are happening in their lives. Now, if you are a person who perhaps suffers with depression or anxiety, and you're watching this and you're challenging yourself to say, well, why am I not having this good time? Why am I not enjoying myself like these other people I see on Facebook? And so I think the comparison really brings about a lot of pressure and more anxiety, especially during the holiday seasons.
And that's why we really want people to be gentle with themselves always, but particularly during the holiday seasons. So with that, I have some helpful hints for today. And number 1 is be aware of your grief and loss and be respectful of your own feelings and the feelings of those family members and allow yourself to grieve as needed. Number 2, be aware of your tendencies toward excesses, and I'm talking about alcohol and drugs. And if you have to, lean into your support systems such as AA, NA, good friends, etc. And number 3, think about and create boundaries for yourself and your family. Number 4, communicate your boundaries with others, because a boundary is no good unless you've verbalized it. And number 5, work with your partner or mate to create healthy traditions. And number 6, communicate expectations. And number 7, find and create meaningful traditions that are unique to your family.
Well, thank you for that, Barbara. And as always, thank you to our listeners for tuning in and listening to the Crappy Mate podcast, and happy holidays. In closing the podcast today, I just want to remind our listeners of our disclaimer. The Crappy Mate podcast is designed to be a useful tool to help individuals and couples have happier and healthier relationships. This podcast is not a substitute for individual or couples therapy. And as always, relationships need to be safe. Seek professional help as needed.
Thank you for listening to the Crappy Mate podcast. We invite you to submit comments, questions, and/or concerns about today's podcast, or give us feedback on relationship topics you'd like to hear covered. We encourage you to try our helpful hints. Give these a go, try them on for size. Remember, you can follow us on our Facebook and Instagram pages under the Crappy Mate podcast. Our website is www.crappymate.com. And please be sure to subscribe. Thank you for listening.